Today's topic, what kind of angles should I use for filming my wrestling show? Coming up. I'm not talking about what angles as far as this guy attacked this guy. I'm talking about camera angles. And I think that's something that not a lot of people think about. They just kind of stick cameras wherever. And one of the most important rules I learned early on was if you have a camera on all four sides of the ring, when you go to play it back in editing, when you switch between those four cameras, it's very disorienting, especially in tag matches. You have one camera here, some guy goes to tag over here, you switch to this angle, and it's very confusing as to, you have to kind of realign yourself, and before you know it, you switch the angle again, and it just gets disorienting to whoever's watching it. There's a rule in filming called the 180 degree rule, where you only have cameras in a 180. So think of it as a circle, and you split that circle in half, eliminate that other half, and only have cameras in this direction. It's much simpler on the eye, it's a lot less distracting to watch, and I think it's an important rule, especially for pro wrestlers to grab onto. I think an important angle, if you can get it, is what's called the fan cam, where you have a guy roving around with the camera and he can get shots. If you can get a gimbal or a stabilizer, perfect, because all too often those shots are shaky and sometimes a little unwatchable. This way you can also film entrances. If not, I always recommend filming the entrance as its own separate camera and then maybe two other cameras. One of the things I always do is if I have my locker room within reach of the venue, so sometimes your locker room is actually in the same room and it's a makeshift locker room, I always try to put the camera on a crane, man-made crane, or they have cranes on Amazon that you can buy for 50 bucks. And what I'll do is I'll section off the locker room so that our guys can actually reach the camera, and I'll have guys who are actually working the show help out and move that camera around. So this way you're not just looking at a couple stagnant shots, and you don't need any additional help. You can just get one or two guys to help you move that camera, or you could do it yourself if you have the time. I always like to throw a GoPro the second I get to the venue, plug it in somewhere, and let it sit, and I always use that as a time lapse, just so I could see how the day went. I like to judge kind of how we did, how long it took to get the ring up, how long it took to get the entranceway up, how long it took to get us to make sure everyone got seated, how long the show took, and all those kind of things go into consideration. Is how many angles you need, how many you're actually going to use. That GoPro angle, I know for a fact, I'll never use that angle. It's just something for me personally. In addition to that, I usually will have 4 other cameras, depending on the show and depending on the size and the scale of things, but usually 4 to 5 cameras out there, including the GoPro. I think you can realistically get away with 2 or 3, and it is good enough. If you have somebody doing the man-made camera, also have what's called a hard camera, a good shot, and always try to aim your camera towards the crowd. I've made this mistake so many times where I've put the camera in behind the crowd, basically, so you're just staring at a bunch of heads, and then the other side of the arena looks empty. Because we didn't set chairs up in that particular spot. So it looks like there's nobody there. And I'm guilty of doing that. Maybe on some of these videos behind me you could see that. But I've done that so many times and it's a big mistake. Always face the camera towards the crowd. If you only have 3 sides filled with people, aim it towards the biggest section. It's so important when you're looking back at that footage to see a full crowd, to see those people interacting. I can't stress that enough. And there's a lot of other things that go into filming a wrestling show. What frame rate you're going to use. I always recommend 60 frames a second. 30 frames just doesn't quite capture the action. 24 frames is way too low. You get too much motion blur when people are punching, kicking, everything like that. It just looks bad, especially if you want to slow down action. It just never looks right. It's always jagged. So I always recommend 60 frames a second. If you can do more, great, do it. But at least 60 frames a second is where you want to be for a pro wrestling show. If you like this video, beat the shit out of the like button below. If you're new here, please consider subscribing.